Recording now. So everybody knows we are recording this webinar and we will be posting it on our website if you want to share it with folks in your town in the future. This is the third of our Looking Forward webinars that we kicked off this series in the fall, and it's designed to help our communities look forward after the pandemic. I had a bunch more people signed up today, so I don't know, who knows what happened with the weather, but we might have a small group. That's okay. Might be easier for questions and that kind of thing. We were thinking that overall, we'd like to leave most of the questions till the end, but feel free to put them in the chat box at any time. And if you do have a clarifying question or something during the presentation, feel free to raise your hand, and hopefully we will catch that. We have a few more people coming on. That's good. Okay. So today's presentation is going to be presented by myself, Susan Westa. I'm the Community Development Lead at the Windham Regional Commission. We also have Chris Campany, our Executive Director, on today as well, and John Bennett, our Associate Director. Want to raise your hand, John? John may be having internet issues, so we're not sure how long he's going to last.
I'm here at the moment, but we'll see. Yeah.
This is the Regional Planning Commission, and I'm a representative from Arbor to it, so this is just a session from them.
Welcome, Edie.
Hi, I hope you can't hear me.
We could. So that's just a reminder then for everybody to mute yourselves if you're not being presented, if you're not presenting or speaking, asking questions. That just helps with the background noise.
No, I'm going to mute myself. I didn't realize I was in control of that. I have a guest here, so that's why I was just.
Yeah, great. Well, we're glad you could make it. Thank you. I'm going to begin today with an overview of what conservation subdivisions are and what they are not. Then Chris is going to get into more detail about how they work and the design of conservation subdivisions. And then John is going to talk, hopefully he'll still be here, more about how to implement this type of development through your town plan and or your land use regulations. And today's presentation will be a fairly high level presentation of this tool, but if it's something that your community is interested in learning more about after you hear this tonight, let us know. Reach out to any of us and let us know, because it's something that we could consider developing a full-blown workshop around to help work through how this would work actually in your community. So to start with, what are conservation subdivisions? Well, they're an alternative approach to traditional subdivision development. And the basic concept is that you would get the same number of lots with a conservation subdivision as you would with a traditional subdivision. However, those lots would be clustered more tightly together. And in the process, you should be able to protect some open space. So to give a real simplified example to get you to understand the idea, if you had a 20-acre parcel and your land use regulations allowed 2-acre lots in that part of town, and that entire site then could be divided up into 10 2-acre lots. Obviously, that's a very simplified version, doesn't account for roads and wetlands and all those kind of things. But just for an example, then with a conservation subdivision, those 10 lots could be clustered more tightly together, say on 1 acre each instead of 2 acres. And in that process, only 10 acres of the site would be developed, and 10 acres could be protected as open space, whether it be important natural features, whatever your town's priorities are. That's the overall concept. These images on the bottom of this slide are from a conservation subdivision in Madison, Connecticut. This site was originally a horse farm, And you can see a real nice neighborhood was created here with these homes on the left. And on the right, you can see the horse fields that were protected and maintained because this was a priority in the community. They wanted to maintain this rural character that historically they had in their town. With this development, they also were able to protect some of the actual horse farm functions to a very limited degree, but still somewhat, and as well as the fields. Another important thing to point out is that through this design process, which Chris is going to talk about in a lot more detail, these attributes that you're interested in protecting should be identified right up front, whether they be important views, wildlife corridors, or agricultural lands, valuable natural resources that your community wants to protect. You should identify those areas right up front, and then the lots can be laid out in a way that protects and preserves those areas. This type of development can also reduce costs in theory, because if you're able to cluster lots more tightly together, you might not have to develop as much roadway as you would otherwise. That's just one example. And you can also create a new sense of community or neighborhood. And I know that some folks prefer living in rural areas on their own in the woods, but some folks who are attracted to rural areas are also interested in living in neighborhoods. And I know that when I lived in Connecticut, at one point I lived on a 2-acre lot that had some protected land across the street, and it was, you know, very nice in many ways, but because my neighbors were also spread out, we really never got to know each other, and that was something that I missed. These images on this slide are from a conservation subdivision in Westford, Massachusetts. These homes are located around a common green area, and that green, it also houses the community septic system. There's also protected land in the back of these homes that houses a trail system. So you can see this can be done in many different ways. So what aren't conservation subdivisions? Well, they don't decrease or increase the amount of development or the amount of lots that are allowed in your community. Whatever your community allows through zoning and subdivision will remain the same. It also does not prevent development. And it is not a panacea against forest and habitat fragmentation. Your community should continue to look at the big picture of habitat connectivity, and it's up to you to ensure that these features are incorporated into your conservation subdivision. And the main way to do that is to be sure that those priorities are clearly laid out in your town plan, in your land use regulations, so everybody understands what you're doing. This type of development is
Excuse me. Hi, Sue, sorry.
Yeah, Gretchen?
Is it possible, can you mute the people on the phone?
That's a good idea. Let's see.
It's really distracting. Sorry.
Yep.
And like we don't get some of the words, so.
Right. I can mute them. Look at that. I think everyone is muted now. I still hear someone though. No, okay. I think we're good.
I think you took care of it, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, I was just going to say that this type of development is probably best in rural residential zones and not necessarily for resource zones that are designed to protect resources. So here we have an example of a hypothetical lot with two subdivisions laid out on the same lot. The one on the left is a traditional subdivision, and you can see the entire site is divided into house lots. And on the example on the right, on my right, is the conservation subdivision. And in that case, the lots were clustered more tightly together. And in that process, they were able to keep the development completely away from the stream corridor, out of an agricultural field in the top corner of the site that was important to the community. They also brought the entire development back away from the road and created a green space in the center of the development. And again, this is just one way that this type of development could work on this site. If the priorities here were a wildlife corridor and the back of the parcel, you might want to bring the whole site to the roadway. I mean, the development to the roadway, so that the wildlife corridor in the back of the site could be protected. The most important thing to remember is that there is a lot more flexibility in this type of design. Some communities allow this type of development, probably most that have conservation subdivisions, leave it up to a developer's discretion to decide whether or not he or she is interested in pursuing this type of development. And some developers prefer it because of the flexibility, because they might be able to save some infrastructure costs, but also the value of real estate can increase because some folks are willing to pay a premium to be located adjacent to some protected open space. Some communities require this type of development in certain zones, but there's always a way out for a developer if this type of development isn't going to work on a specific site for whatever reason. They can come back with a traditional subdivision design. And some communities promote this sort of development with density bonuses to promote certain priorities such as affordable housing or in order to protect additional open space. And there are also multiple options for how to manage the open space. You can most often probably a homeowners association is used, but in many cases a land trust or a conservation commission, some third party that has an interest in protecting open space may be used. Turning to on-site infrastructure, probably most of the sites that we would have this type of development on, and this part of Vermont would require on-site wells and septic systems. And that is somewhat limiting in the amount that you can cluster because you need to make sure you have space for that septic system and that well on each slot, and there needs to be the appropriate separation distance, in between them. One thing that some communities do is use shared sewer or septic systems and or water supplies in order to have more flexibility. And even if you just take one of those out of the picture, let's say have a community water supply, but still have individual septic systems, that gives you some more flexibility in how you can cluster your parcels. Another thing to consider is incorporating other priorities into your open space, whether it be, food production on agricultural lands or even energy generations. You might want to have a couple or some solar panels, for example, on some of the open space if that was a priority for your community. And finally, these are some of the many benefits that are possible with this kind of development. Again, I want to stress the value of the flexibility. These images on the top show another example of how this type of design could be used. The site analysis shows how they identified the most buildable areas on the site first. The image in the center shows the traditional subdivision and the number of lots that they could get with that. And on the right is the same number of lots clustered in a couple different parts of the site. In this case, the green area was connected to some other open spaces and was used as an important wildlife corridor, so they wanted to keep it open, although they do have a trail system in it. And on the left, that yellow area was a field that had been hayed for many years by a local farmer, and they want to keep that intact as well. It has a stone wall along one edge of it, and they were able to keep most of that and through this process, have the development, have some nice neighborhoods, and protect some important features for the community. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who is going to get into some more details.
Thank you, Sue. So you may hear me ask Sue to move slides or move the cursor around. I'll just give you a brief history of conservation subdivisions. I actually first became aware of them when I was on a planning board in the town of Gardner, New York, before I became a professional planner. And this was both before and then during the right after 9/11. Gardner was in Ulster County, New York. You saw a surge of people moving to Orange County, New York, and then that spread into the adjoining counties of like Ulster and Sullivan. And so this was presented by, we had a planning consultant, and these were presented and as a tool. And one of the reasons why conservation subdivisions are a good tool is they tend to be pretty easy to get your head around as both a planning commission and as a zoning administrator. In Gardner, the issue was we're trying to conserve some relatively large areas of land as contiguous forest and farmland. We're looking at conservation subdivisions for the area that we would consider in Vermont, and also there, rural residential, where we had like 2 acre zoning, trying to conserve more land and create more of a open space network, and also especially protect river and stream corridors for habitat primarily. But later on, when I became Deputy Commissioner of Planning for Orange County, New York, we're using this more as a tool for farmland conservation. And later on, we used it in Maryland. It was attractive to developers because there you had very stringent water quality regulations, and you could actually use it to help reduce your impervious surface, which was very limited, and it was also very expensive because of the stormwater management infrastructure that you had to put in place. Later on, when I moved to Mississippi, it was looked at as a way to have just frankly better development in the wake of Katrina in areas in coastal Mississippi. Here, one of the reasons why I really wanted to present this to you guys here in the region is I know it is a challenge it's a challenge for the region, it's a challenge especially for towns to really plan for, zone for, and create infrastructure for the compact settlement that most of our plans say we want to have. And so the path of least resistance is large lot development out on town roads. And this can be a tool that you can use to try, this is not a tool that you're going to want to use in, say, resource land, areas that you're intentionally conserving as working lands, as farmland, as forest land, or protect as habitat. But those areas where you tend to allow things like 2 acre zoning, those rural residential areas, this is a tool that you can use to help try to reduce habitat fragmentation, to try to create chains of conserved land, and frankly also come up with a development pattern that is ultimately going to be more energy efficient, have fewer stormwater impacts, and just other things looking forward if we do in fact see greater development here in the region. So this is a tool, but it's nothing magic. It's not a shortcut for comprehensive land use planning and other tools to protect lands that really should not be developed for whatever reason. So conservation subdivisions is to protect farmland or natural resources while also allowing for the maximum number of residences allowed under current community zoning and subdivision regs, and it's a pretty simple tool to administer. Go ahead, Sue. You have to hit the button. I got a couple of animations in here. The idea too is that if you have an open space plan, you don't have to have one for conservation subdivisions, but ideally, if you do have conservation subdivision requirements or incentives, ideally it could actually help create chains of open space that could all then be connected, right? So as I was saying, you could protect wildlife corridors. It could also even be a way to promote and support interconnected trails across the landscape through permanently conserved land. And so ideally it could create actual green amenities, not only for the owners within the subdivision that's created, and that's a benefit to the people who live within the subdivision that's created, but also for the community as a whole. And just a quick note about conservation subdivisions: they can be they can be done in all kinds of ways, to where, like, the conserved land is only accessible by those people who own property in that subdivision, or as I've been discussing, it can be part of a larger publicly accessible, maybe privately held, but publicly accessible open space network, you know, so that basically the general public could access it too. Go ahead, Sue. But the fundamental the approach to conservation design is identifying land that's to be preserved. It kind of turns conventional subdivision design on its head by identifying the open space and the conservation areas first, and then letting that size and location become the central organizing element driving the rest of the design. And so what you'll see is, well, go ahead, Sue. I'll show some examples. So in any kind of subdivision development, there are some areas that you just cannot develop because of rules and regulations, right? So like wetlands, water bodies, floodplains, steep slopes, highly erodible soils, and other things that you may have in your town regs or state regs that are areas that you just can't develop. And those are called primary conservation areas. Go to the next slide, Sue. And then under conservation subdivisions, you want to identify other things that you want to conserve, like mature woodlands, upland buffers, buffers around wetlands and water bodies like streams and rivers, prime farmland, natural meadows, critical wildlife habitat. There may be sites of historical, cultural, or archaeological significance, so it's not just necessarily the natural features, and even view sheds like into, out of, and within the site. Go ahead, Sue. And so what you do to start off with is you calculate the density for conservation subdivisions. And what do we mean by that? So you identify the primary conservation areas. Go to the next slide, so it may be easier for me to show this as opposed to. So I think I may have. Okay, you go back one, Sue. I'm sorry. So what you're going to do is you're going to first basically lay out the conventional subdivision. And when you lay out a conventional subdivision, typically what you do is you lay out the lots in a way that maximizes the number of house lots that you can have on a site. And you're going to, whether you're doing a conservation subdivision or conventional subdivision, you're going to do, the developer's probably going to do that first. And then coming up with that, what we call a conventional yield, will tell you basically how many house sites that developer is entitled to on that site. So go to the next slide, Sue. So we're going to use a hypothetical lot here, or hypothetical parcel, 140-acre parcel. And Sue, if you can drive just a little bit, if you look at it, go back to that green slide. There you go. So Sue, if you can move the cursor around just a little bit, right there in that corner, that'd be the existing homeowner's site. Let's say that's a farm complex with multiple outbuildings, and they own all that land, and there's some, if you can see, there's rolling terrain, wooded terrain, there's some wet meadows, there's a hayfield up there in the center. You can't see all the detail, but as we'll show later, there's like a cabin on part of the property, some stone walls. And right at the very bottom of the lot, that's a river. And so that's both a river, a floodplain, wet soils, and a wildlife corridor. So go to the next slide, Sue. So you're going to identify first as primary conservation areas, and these are things that can't be built on anyway. And so you're going to look at those things. You're going to basically subtract that acreage from what can be developed. Go to the next slide. And then under conventional subdivision layout, you're going to lay out the lots to maximize how many buildable lots that you've got. And if you notice, and if you're familiar with this, this is going to not sound new to you. If you're new to this, it's going to sound new. If you notice, you have different lot sizes, right? Well, that's because in some cases you've got this. This is assuming 2 acre zoning. In some cases, you may have the soils and all the other site conditions to make a 2 acre lot work as a building lot. In other cases, your lots are going to have to be bigger because you're going to have the house and the well and the septic on the lot. And you may also have other constraints like those shallow soils or steep slopes or floodplain or something like that. And then also, when you lay out a conventional subdivision, you are going to lay out some sites that may generate more income, like some of those that will ultimately have river frontage, those that you can get a premium price for. But a lot of it's driven by what's actually buildable, what you can actually build on. Go to the next slide. Oh, and the yield there was 42 lots. So here you see the conventional sub. You can go to the next slide, so it's okay. So there you see the conventional subdivision layout taking into account all those primary conservation areas, also just known as restricted areas. Go to the next slide. And so here's your conventional subdivision layout, and that would look a lot like a conventional subdivision layout anywhere in the country, including Vermont. It's not bad. Some people have really big lots, other people have small lots. Generally speaking, each person has their own, individual property, and that's probably, you're probably not necessarily going to feel comfortable walking across those property boundaries. And what you're going to see later is there's actually 2 separate stream crossings under this design. I'll get to that in a bit later. Go to the next one. And that's just, again, the lot, conventional lot layout relative to, what it would look like on the land. Go to the next slide, Sue. So in a planning conservation subdivision, so you've already done the, you've calculated that conventional subdivision yield. Now what you're going to do is you're going to look at other significant existing resources on the site, identified as secondary conservation areas. You're going to identify potential development areas on the site. You identify the house sites. And then once you've identified the house sites, then you figure out where the street and trail network is going to be laid out to connect the homes. And then you add the lot lines. So if you think about it, it's kind of the inverse of the conventional subdivision layout. You do lot lines last as opposed to first. Go ahead, Natsu. So step 1, identifying existing significant resources. Go ahead. So you've already identified those restricted areas as primary conservation areas. Go to the next slide. So now you're going to start looking at other things that you want to conserve. And so if you can drive the cursor around a little bit. So in this case, what they've identified is where the streams are. And you can see that they've got blue buffers around them. They've also identified, instead of just steep slopes, moderate slopes. They've identified a spring in one place. They've also, in the kind of the far right side, they've identified a rock outcrop. And that kind of big eyebrow looking thing, that's indicating a view outwards from that rock outcrop. So those are things that they want to conserve. Go to the next slide. And then they're going to look at other attributes. So again, so if you can drive, you've got things like, you got a stone wall, a stand of red buds there, and there's a view. If you notice, they've noticed a view into the site from the road that they want to preserve. There's the historic site down in the bottom left-hand corner. That's the existing old historic farm property. They've identified with the slashed area, that's an identified wildlife corridor, which also kind of overlaps with wet soils and floodplain. They've identified, if you remember, there were 2 other streams. There's some meadows that they've identified kind of in that lower left quadrant. And then there's a hayfield in the center. And then there are woodlands all off to the on the right-hand side of the site. And so, and this is just an example, a hypothetical site. In other sites, there may be, say, evidence of pre-Columbian settlement that you want to preserve, or other attributes, old cellar holes, things that, historical aspects of the site that you want to conserve, and but also, contribute to the aesthetic value of the site. Go ahead, Sue. So now you're going to identify potential development areas. And so go ahead. So you're going to say, so the objective is to accommodate 42 house lots, and the developer, the designer, there are going to be some trade-offs. In this scenario, what they're going to do is they're going to choose the large hay meadow and field as location for most of the building envelopes in order to maximize the amount of woodland left intact for wildlife and water quality benefits. They'll want to keep critical contiguous areas intact to maintain their ecological function and serve as wildlife corridors. And the farmhouse is going to be on its own lot, kept apart from everything else to basically keep its historical context intact. And also, probably that'd be a valuable piece of property, because there is a profit motive here, right, for the developer, and so that you're going to need to take that into account. Go to the next slide. And so we've identified two basic areas. The green areas are those areas to be conserved, and the yellow are potential development areas determined through the site inventory and analysis of where the area is best suited for the house sites. Go to the next slide. And so what you do then is you lay out where the houses are best situated. And that's important because by identifying where the houses go, that then informs where the roads and other, trail networks and other things to connect those houses, where they'll go. And so in this case, you're not designing by lot size and lot location. You're designing by the most suitable house sites. And in this case too, and you'll see once we kind of get to the final design, there is a goal here of basically creating a neighborhood or two neighborhoods on this site. The goal is not just each person having their own lot. The idea is to create a neighborhood that then has all this shared open space that everybody can enjoy. Go to the next slide. And so here's how the house locations relate to the areas to be conserved and the areas to be developed. Go ahead, Sue. And so then you lay out the street and trail network. Go next. Hey, Lynn, can you mute yourself? There you go. Thank you. So you lay out, so the idea here is to lay out street and trails in a manner that minimize stream crossings. Why? Because one of the goals is, again, to streams are generally considered to be good wildlife habitat. Also critical, they tend to be critical habitat connectivity, critical wildlife habitat corridors. Also, they're expensive. And whenever you have a stream crossing, that's more permitting and other things they have to take into account. And then footpaths might, oftentimes they'll follow existing trails, or in this case, the language here is wood roads, but also, we would consider them logging roads, just other, you can lay out the trails in ways that connect the neighborhoods, connect the houses, and connect to the attributes that you want people to access. But in fact, you might want to keep them out of critical habitat areas and corridors. That doesn't mean people can't wander down through them, but if you're trying to protect a wildlife corridor, you may not want to put a trail right smack dab in the middle of it. Go ahead, Sue. And so here's what it looks. Here's what it looks like once you've added the roads, the driveways, and the trails. And this can be a benefit to developers. You can actually wind up as a developer with having to develop less road, and then for the subdivision, that means you're developing less road to ultimately have to maintain. But the dark black lines, those are that's the main road in, and the dashed lines are trails that run throughout the site. And if you notice, they go through like the buffered areas on the edges, but they stay out of the wildlife corridors. There's a trail that takes you to that scenic overlook on the right hand of the site. Because the original home site is intentionally going to be kind of kept apart from the larger subdivision, there are no trails connecting it. And that's just an example. That's just with this example. Go ahead to the next slide. Slide 2. And so here's what it looks like: the primary and secondary conservation areas, and the house and street and trail layout. Go to the next slide. And then you add the lot lines. And so each lot has, in this case, the local regs, the local health regs require a minimum of 32,000 square feet to accommodate a well and septic system. The historic farmhouse complex is going to remain on its own. And the lot lines will take into account rights of way, like the shared roadways. And so go ahead to the next slide, Sue. And so here's what the ultimate layout is. This is the roads, the trails, all the amenities, the house sites. And this is basically the master plan for this conservation subdivision. Go to the next slide. And that's what it would look like, laying upon the land. Go to the next slide. And so here's just comparing the conservation lot line layout with the conventional lot line layout. And you can just see under the conventional lot line layout, the incentive is to develop the entire property, develop the entire property in individual lots. Whereas with the conservation subdivision, you have smaller house lots. That's also less for the homeowner to have to maintain. And then you wind up with a lot of common area that permanently conserves space for either the residents of that subdivision to enjoy, or hopefully the larger public, depending on how that works out. Go to the next slide. And here's just a combination, just how it lays on the land, the conventional subdivision on the left-hand side and the conservation subdivision on the right-hand side. Go to the next slide. And again, the original lot, undeveloped condition, and then the conservation subdivision design solution. Go to the next slide. Versus the original condition and the conventional solution. Go ahead, Sue. And so what did you accomplish? Just over 35 acres were consumed by development of house lots and households. The average lot size is 36,500 square feet compared to the conventional minimum lot size of 80,000 square feet or 2 acres. The street right-of-way consumes an additional 7.3 acres, leaving a net of 97.5 acres, or 70% of the tract undivided and permanently preserved. Go ahead, Sue. And that's it for my part of the presentation. I will turn it over to John, and then we'll take questions.
All righty. So, how can a town try to advance the use of conservation subdivisions? A couple of regulatory and non-regulatory methods. Non-regulatory, so to speak, is using the town plan to explain what they are and advocate for using them, as in having policies that said in these areas we should or we shall use conservation subdivisions to protect valuable resources, and to have meaningful force in Act 250 proceedings where projects have to be found to conform with the town plan. You have to have very prescriptive language using will or must instead of should or encourage, and etc. And then the strictly or purely regulatory methods for implementing them would be including provisions for them in your zoning bylaws or your subdivision regulations, or if you had one, a unified development bylaw. Next slide, Sue. So town plans are authorized by state statute. 30 seconds of history. Vermont is not a home rule state. Towns can only do those things that are authorized by state statute, and town plans are authorized by the statute, and there are requirements for them. They have to have 12 elements, including a land use plan, transportation plan, housing element, and a bunch more. And there are statutory requirements for the adoption process, including having public hearings by the Planning Commission, or public hearing by the Planning Commission, and then a public hearing by the Select Board, and then a vote to adopt. So the land use plan, part of the town plan, is intended to indicate what the town's desired future is in terms of what's open space and what's developed, and would be a logical place to explain and advocate for the use of conservation subdivisions. Next. So, to be clear, a town can only adopt or amend land use regulations if it has a current adopted town plan. So, not only are bylaws supposed to implement the plan, but you can't adopt or change them if you don't have a current plan. And any of the tools have to be in conformance with the plan, meaning they have to make progress towards attaining, or at least not interfere with, the goals and policies in the plan. And they should provide for the proposed future land uses, densities, and intensities contained in the plan. Next. So, a couple of the regulatory tools authorized by statute: zoning bylaws, which can regulate land development and specifically cited areas, including uses of land and shoreland facilities and dimensions, location, construction, and use of structures, and areas to be occupied and open spaces to be left unoccupied, and they can specify timing, sequence of growth, and et cetera. And a recent addition to the statute was that they can regulate development within a river corridor and buffer. Next. Subdivision regulations, also authorized by statute, and have a number of required components. I guess a slight digression is that some towns regulate subdivision within their zoning. Other towns have a separate subdivision regulation. There's a minor quirk there that if you have your subdivision regulations within your zoning, that affects Act 250 jurisdiction. But I won't go into the weeds there. Suffice it to say that if you have both subdivision and zoning regulations, then your the jurisdictional threshold for Act 250 is much higher. It's 10 acres instead of 1 acre. Next slide, please. And so, Unified Development Bylaw, authorized under statute, and you may integrate your land use regulations all into one Unified Development Bylaw. At a minimum, they have to consolidate zoning and subdivision, but they should also incorporate other bylaws and should cross-reference other ordinance adopted by the town that affect land development. Sometimes towns adopt ordinances. I know Guilford went that route with an attempt at flood hazard area regulations. If you had separate flood hazard area regulations, you would want to cross-reference them in your Unified Development Bylaw. So, sorry about the dive into the weeds, but there's a lot there, and we'll be happy to answer questions. That's it, Sue, for me.
You're muted, Sue.
Sue's still muted. Anyway.
Unmute. I was trying to
I think-
focus on how to stop screen sharing so we can answer questions. Let's see. How do we stop that? Well, anyways, we do have some questions here, so I am going to, well, no, these are just some nice comments about the presentation. While I'm trying to figure this out, though, if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question, we can do that.
And you can raise the virtual hand or an actual hand if we can see you. If we can't see you, it's hard.
All right.
Or just blurt it out. I think everybody can unmute
There you go. I
themselves.
think Sam has a question.
Sam,
All
go ahead.
right, Sam.
Yeah, I would, wouldn't I? My question is, our zoning bylaws, I'm on the planning commission in Dummerston, and we have a planned unit development article in the zoning bylaw. And I'm wondering if you want to elaborate on the differences between what a planned unit development would allow for versus what this other type of, you know, I don't quite know how it would be written into a zoning bylaw, but this conservation development, you know, how it would differ, because it seems that a planned unit development could be revised or updated to stress, you know, conservation. That's my question.
John, do you want to start with that? You want me to start with that? What?
You can start, or I'll take a stab. Either way, what's your pleasure?
I'll take a. Why don't I start? Sam, my take is that planned unit developments would cover a broader array of development options, whereas conservation subdivision would be more narrowly focused for that specific purpose, probably in a specific zone, you know, like rural residential or something, whereas we have the PUD option for a greater variety of zones. John, what would you say?
I would more or less agree with that. That the PUD generally encompasses a much broader variety, or can encompass a much broader variety of uses, commercial and etc., as opposed to the subdivision regs we're talking about are aimed relatively exclusively at residential. And not to go too far into the weeds, but for a while, Vermont had a provision that you could have a PUD for stuff that involved commercial, and then you could have a PRD that was for a planned residential development. They have since removed that provision, and it's reverted back to just general PUD. But if you had PUD provision in your zoning, and then you could therein say, for specific areas, we would like you to use you shall use the conservation subdivision provisions that we've adopted in our conservation, in our subdivision regulations. I'm going to apologize right now to say I'm getting a dialog box. Your internet connection is unstable. So I will try to hang in, but I may just ditch the video at least to try and prolong the pleasure of conversing with you all.
And Sue, if you have anything there you want to add, go ahead. I know usually John and I have been fielding the more technical questions, but you feel free to jump right in.
Yeah, well, in Connecticut, when I was working on conservation subdivisions, most of those communities weren't using planned unit development anymore. So this was the main way that they were trying to allow more flexibility through the design process. And many communities, you know, when I had first started talking about them, and the organization I worked with down there, Newcomb Extension, were nervous about it. However, once one adopted this form of regulations and others saw what was happening, even though others didn't jump right on board, it was easier for them to understand. And eventually, you know, after sometimes many years, they were adopting this form of regulations. There's a lot more development pressure down there too, but that could happen here at any time.
And just one thing to add to what Sue just said is relative to a planned unit development, which again may incorporate a lot more of other uses. The conservation subdivision, if that's your primary goal, it's just much easier in your zoning bylaws to set up relative to PUD requirements. It's just a bit easier to administer because basically it's just calculate the conventional yield, identify these other areas. You know, it's just easier. And that was when, I guess it's fair to say Randall Arendt, who's a planner down in Massachusetts, used to be at UMass, the planning department down there. That's part of why they developed it, was to make it easier for citizen-driven planning commissions to administer. Any other questions?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to dominate, but I'd love to hear from other towns if they've tried any alternative types of regulations like this. Dummerston only within the last 2 years adopted something that we basically made up that we called variable lot size. It's not really like the conservation development in that it really only applies to the larger lots in larger than 2 acre zoning districts. I guess we just didn't feel that we wanted to touch the small lots, and particularly because of you get into issues with septic permits. But it is a way for someone who owns, you know, 100-acre parcel in conservation, which is a 10-acre minimum, to, you know, develop the land with, you know, up to 10 house lots without chopping it all up into 10-acre lots. And ideally to, you know, have those smaller house lots clustered and close to the road and leaving. But our tool was not a conservation easement, which would have, you know, required this third party to be involved, but just simply to have the maximum number of lots recorded in the land records. But that was the biggest stumbling block, was how to, you know, have this be enforced over time. You know, in 50 years, everyone would be dead who would remember that, hey, wait a minute, you know, this guy got 3 2-acre house lots on his 100-acre parcel. He can't now go and chop his parcel up into all the 10-acre parcels he wants. And again, this is getting into the weeds. And I think you mentioned at the beginning that, you know, if people were actually interested in designing something, that would be another evening. So I don't want to scare people away.
So
but if other towns have some interest or comments, I mean, we have something in our bylaws at this point that's sort of similar. It's not the same, but we're really interested. I mean, I think this is a concern that lots of towns have if they don't want to see some of these large parcels chopped up and they don't have a tool to regulate it. We think what we have works, would hold up in court. It's been used once. So far, so good.
Well, this process would be a clear way to, you know, ensure that that land was preserved and protected into the future. I mean, I suppose you could have something that went with the deeds, of the individual parcels, maybe to say that they couldn't be, you know, subdivided further in the future. But yeah, without really understanding how your process works, it's kind of hard.
So does conservation, would the conservation regs always involve a third party to hold the conservation easement?
Not necessarily, but that is one way to make sure that the land is permanently protected, because if you have somebody else who is looking at that, it you know, helps.
But it can also be it could be the homeowners association.
Absolutely.
It doesn't have to be a land trust or anything like that. It can be the homeowners association
Yeah.
to do that. And in this case, you'd probably want to have that anyway, because you've got a shared common driveway. You know, in that example we showed, there's a bridge.
Yeah.
So you'd probably want a homeowners association just for that basic thing. You know, not the same level of control as like Del Boca Vista Phase 2 in Orlando, you know, where they're regulating whether or not you can hang laundry outside, or whether or not you can have a flag or something like that. But something to actually, you know, maybe there's a homeowner's fee to manage the trails on the site, in addition to the bridge and roads. So you just treat it like you would any other homeowners association, where there's a conservation element to it. And the other difference too, Sam, relative to I think what I understand you guys did is there would be slightly less parcelization. It doesn't get to the larger parcelization problem that we have in Vermont with the divvying up of large forest tracts and large farm tracts. But in your 2-acre zoning realm, you're at least eliminating, you're still going to have potentially the same number of lots, but occupying a much smaller area. So that permanently conserved area is going to be a lot bigger, if that makes sense. And then again, ideally, and this is easier, I think, maybe this may be easier for folks to get their head around in the context that Sue was talking about, where you start having more development. Right now, I think it's challenging for a lot of towns to really see the need for an open space plan, because right now it feels like you've got open space all over the place. But when you start seeing a level of development like what she was seeing in Connecticut, you realize how fragile that is once it all starts getting built on, just on the existing lots. And so you develop this open space plan, and ideally what would happen is when you develop these conservation subdivisions, you would have all this permanently conserved land running right up like the river corridor or a ridge line or other habitat connectors from the ridges, you know, down the streams to the river or something like that. And so you develop these open space plans to try to better ensure that all of that is ultimately contiguous, and conservation subdivisions are just a way to get there. And then in other cases too, frankly, so Sue was saying, some developers just like them because not everybody wants the weird shaped 10-acre narrow lot, you know, that's maybe 100 feet wide, because that's what they had to do to get a little bit of river frontage and get a septic tank on there. But in this case, they own a much smaller lot. And, but then they have, everybody in that subdivision has access to all of that land. And so you actually get a price premium for it.
All right, I'm going to just jump in really briefly to Sam's question about the variable lot size provision. Not to go into the weeds, and you and I can engage in a longer conversation about this at some other point. I'd be happy to, but presumably there's some provision that has to be recorded in the land records, that permit. So
that's the way we've written it. Yeah.
Any other questions? Gretchen?
All right. I am getting a more internet instability dialogue. You guys are freezing up, so enjoy. I will try to listen in.
Thanks, John. Go ahead, Gretchen.
Thanks, John.
So have other towns in Windham County done any of this work on the zoning bylaw level?
So I am not aware of them. but I don't know if Chris or John are. I believe that in other parts of the state they have.
Donna, did you guys do this in Wardsboro?
I'm sorry, because I missed the whole beginning of this webinar, because I was in another meeting, that I really am feeling a little bit lost in what the conversation is right now.
Okay, I couldn't remember if you guys had like a clustered subdivision requirement in any of your zoning. I remember looking at that one proposed development. I couldn't remember if you guys had some kind of clustered development requirement or not.
Nothing solid.
Okay, not trying to put you on the spot. And Gretchen, probably, I imagine most of our towns haven't felt it. A lot of towns go this route again when they feel development pressure. I imagine we haven't really felt the pressure here yet. And back when when the Valley was feeling this kind of pressure, this tool really wasn't kind of commonly used or understood.
Mm-hmm.
But we could certainly try to host a workshop if folk really want to. If enough towns really want to dig into this, we could probably host a workshop. I know they exist because I took one back in around 2000 or so.
And I think there are some examples down the Pioneer Valley, so not too far away.
And I know that, Chris, you had done, I think at one of the, meetings, a little bit about this. So always learn interesting things. So just kind of like another quick question about developers. Are they discouraged by this? Because are the buyers of these properties going, want to be so clustered, or do they want a larger lot that is more private?
So
and is that,
I think if folks want larger lots, they're not going to come to this kind of development. They're going to go to where they can find those larger lots. And I think what my experience was in Connecticut was that some developers had a hard time wrapping their head around this and, pushed back against it. But others, once they figured it out and worked it out, often preferred it.
mm-hmm. Because it is cheaper to.
It can be, because of the flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
A really good example of one. I know it's also held up as a new urbanist development, but Seaside, Florida has worked out pretty well for those developers, and so has Disney Celebration. I mean, those are extreme examples, but basically,
and those are more than residential.
Yeah, those are extreme, but yeah, I mean, and frankly, if you want the large lots, you've got them right now.
Right.
We have plenty of those. You look at any parcel, town parcel map, we're replete with those. And so, and if you do actually do a density bonus, it is a way to actually increase the number of, we had said, some towns don't want that, but you can actually, incentivize this by saying, okay, if you do conservation subdivision, you're going to get 2 additional dwelling units relative to what you have. And it can also make like shared septic or shared drinking water an option, which can also decrease costs, but also, frankly, not everybody, especially people who might be moving here, not everybody loves the idea of individual septic and well. That's just something that they don't want to deal with. Now, if you're in a town that already has water, has sewer, you can still use this. But there are ways to try that where you can kind of give people neighborhood living, but still access to all the outdoor amenities to that larger site. And that can be a strong selling point.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess the ultimate question to your answer, Gretchen, is it depends. Any other questions? All right.
Well, it's after 7, so I'm sure folks have other things to do this evening. But really, if you have questions, oh, Sam, do you have something else right now?
Nope, I was just going to say thank you. And
Okay. Yeah, and if you have, other questions, feel free to reach out to any of us at any time if you're really interested, and we can figure out how to, as John says, get more into the weeds.
And I'll just add one quick thing that we're collaborating more and more with our counterparts in New Hampshire and Franklin County and Mass. And one of the things that we're talking about doing is like shared trainings or something like that. So something we could actually look at doing is host a share, like if we don't have a critical mass in Windham region, we might have a critical mass, like to hire Randall Aaron or somebody else to do a conservation subdivision workshop, some weekend or something, with our counterparts in other states, especially once we're able to meet in person again.
Yeah, Sam?
I think that would be really interesting, not just, I mean, it's great to get the Windham region towns together to share, problems and successes. But to get together with people across the border and talk about what their zoning is like would be fascinating.
Yeah.
Because basically, most of our zoning bylaws in the towns that have them in Windham County are pretty darn similar. Some are written better than others, but we got a lot of the same provisions. So it would be really interesting to compare with Massachusetts, because it looks the same. You drive over there, you wouldn't know you were in a different state,
Right.
But I bet on paper it's very different.
A lot of what I see in Vermont looks a lot like what I saw in New York and other places.
Okay, well, maybe it's not. In that case, we could talk about what we have in common.
Well, thanks everybody so much. So you want to close this out? So it's been recorded. We'll have this available. And
Yep, absolutely. We'll post it on our website within the next couple days.
thanks everybody.